Vamos a iniciar esta segunda jornada con la conferencia del profesor Orlando Figes, que se llama, en este caso, el impacto de la represión sobre la vida privada y la identidad soviética. Vamos a hacer una presentación de 1 hora más o menos, y luego de eso va a haber una ronda de preguntas y conversación. En la tarde, a las 3 de la tarde, va a continuar esta actividad con la presentación del profesor argentino Horacio Tarcus, que va a proponer una ponencia que se llama 100 años del Estado y la Revolución, el libro de Lenin. Se llama La teoría leninista de la política, el Estado y el poder. Luego habrá una pausa y continuaremos y terminaremos esta actividad con una mesa que se llama El legado de la Revolución Rusa y la política chilena, con el profesor Luis Tilleman, Ricardo Jara y Marcos Pauso. Entonces, sin más, los dejo ahora con la charla del profesor Orlando Figes.
Thank you, Rolando, and thank you once again for the invitation to speak. I am going to address a number of issues which have arisen from my research on 2 books, The Whisperers, Private Life in Stalin's Russia, which was a big oral history project with the Memorial Organization, thank you, which we carried out in the early 2000s, interviewing, not just with Memorial but with other projects. I ran over 400 families about their experience of the Stalin years. And the second of the 2 books is the one I'm going to start with. I don't know what it's called, Carla. What is it called in Spanish? In English it's called Just Send Me Word. What is the title of the book in Spanish?
Una palabra tuya, amor y muerte en el Buda.
Okay, I'm not sure if you heard that. I can't repeat it, that's for sure. This is the... Oh, how do I start it? Oh, I see. I just wanted to show you the letter base, that it's... yeah, thank you. If you could just start there. Thank you. This shows the trunk of letters that was discovered or hauled to the memorial offices by one of their workers, and it's about 1,250 letters between Lev and Svetlana Mishenko, who are this couple, who at the time of the project were still alive, living in Moscow, at that time in their 90s. Lev born in 1917, Svetlana a little bit afterwards, and they met as students at Moscow University in the physics faculty, courted, but were not yet married when war broke out in 1941, and at that time Lev was involved in a physics research project, a sort of astrophysics, measuring light as it entered the hemisphere at high altitudes. Lev volunteered for the war, so as did many students at that time, going off to the front completely unprepared to resist the German tanks, armoured divisions, and like thousands of other soldiers, was almost immediately captured, sent to German concentration camps during the war, a whole series of labour camps in occupied Soviet territory and then later in Germany, ending up at Buchenwald at the end of the war. And on a convoy, one of the death marches out of Buchenwald in 1945, ran away into the woods and was liberated by the Americans, who in their interrogation centre tried to persuade him to go back to head west. Perhaps his physics background was of interest to them, I don't know. Lev had not heard anything from Svetlana all these years, obviously. He'd been in German camps, but decided nonetheless he wanted to go home to the Soviet Union. Svetlana had some inkling that he might still be alive because she'd been visited by Nkvd, by KGB men during the war, who had rumours of his existence for supposedly collaborating with the Germans on the basis of informers in the camps he had been in Germany, who then returned to the Soviet Union. The Germans had a policy of sending back prisoners to Soviet territory to act as spies, and no doubt one of them had heard Lev speaking German. He spoke German, and he was forced to work in some of the German camps as a translator. That was to be his undoing, because in 1945, when he heads to Soviet territory, he goes through what they call filtration, filtrovka, when they basically, all Soviet military personnel coming back were interrogated, and anyone who had allowed themselves to be captured was naturally suspicious to the Stalinist authorities. And Lev was tortured and interrogated over a long period, and then signed what turned out to be his confession to espionage. He had trusted his interrogator to make an accurate assessment of the interrogation, but he had actually deceived him, and Lev had been naive. So he was sentenced to 25 years and went off on a convoy to Pechora, which was one of Stalin's worst labor camps in the far north of Russia, where, to begin with, he was involved in this sort of labor. Pechora was a camp where they processed wood coming from colonies of the camp, even further north in the Arctic Circle. Wood in the short season when the waters were navigable and not iced up, wood would be floated down and hauled out of the river, as you can see these prisoners at Pechora doing, in order to be processed, dried, processed, and used for manufacturing furniture, bits of for the assembly of housing in other Gulag settlements. I don't want to talk too long about Pechora, only to say that he was rescued from this. In 1945 to 6, when these sort of workers were working on the hauling of timber, the death rate in the camp was very high indeed. Probably about 40% for that year died. There was no infirmary. The infirmary was just an isolation centre. So Lev undoubtedly would have ran a high risk of dying that year, but he was rescued because one day he was drying himself after a day's work and was discovered by a man called Strelkov. And Strelkov was a very interesting character. He'd been given 25 years too, and always had been assumed to be dead. He was a very senior Bolshevik administrator, technician, engineer in the Gulag system, and was in charge of the laboratory at Pechora, where he was carrying out investigations to try and speed up the process of drying and other experiments that might make the Gulag more efficient. And Strelkov had recognized in Lev someone who was educated and might be useful, and put him in charge of the electric power station, which is incredible if you think about it. High voltage wires running everywhere. Lev has absolutely no electrical management expertise. He's a physicist, but he's being put in charge of this power station running the laboratory and other parts of the Gulag labor camp. And his first task is then to try and work out how to make this more efficient, and he dedicates a lot of his time to trying to make the system more efficient. Once he's in the laboratory, at that time, this wasn't the Gulag of the 1930s anymore, this was the Gulag of the late 1940s, and Lev found a way of smuggling letters out. Getting letters out. He got. I mean, prisoners had some rights to write. Many prisoners didn't write to people they loved because they didn't necessarily want to burden them with their letters. But Lev summed up the courage one day to write to Svetlana. This was a letter sent by his monthly allowance. In that camp they were allowed one letter out per 3 months. And he sent his letter out to Svetlana, who replied. So she clearly been sort of waiting, but at this time she was working in a research institute in the rubber industry. Rubber was a very important industry for the Soviets. They were trying to develop more efficient tires and other products for the extreme temperatures they had. And she was working in Moscow in one of these institutes. And then gradually they began to find a way of smuggling letters in and out of the labour camp. I can go into how that happened, but it's not really what I want to focus on in this talk. There were ex-prisoners there, free settlers who were prepared to smuggle letters in and out, often for some sort of payment, or which could be sent in the form of goods in kind, in parcels that would be sent, and so on. So there was a smuggling system, and Lev and Svetlana made full use of it. Of those letters I showed you, I couldn't tell you how many were censored, really, it's difficult to tell, but a large proportion of them were smuggled, and therefore free of censorship. Not free of self-censorship, but free of censorship by the Gulag authorities. And so they're very revealing letters about the nature of life in the camp, and I think they're a fantastic source that tell us a good deal about the sort of psychological state of prisoners, the tensions in relationships, if they're maintained with people like Svetlana outside. Anyway, that's not the point I really want to talk about. I'm happy to answer questions or discuss that aspect of this story further if you like. What I want to focus on is how it impacted on Lev and Svetlana's belief system. One of the things that Lev, Svetlana's often writing to him saying, let me send you this, let me send you that, medicine, foodstuffs. And Lev says, no, it's a burden for her, obviously, after a long day's work to go standing in queues trying to get food to send him help. And Lev really doesn't want her to do that, but the one thing he's always asking for is books, especially electrical engineering books, because he wants to make the power station work. He's fully aware that this is a stupid, idiotic system they're running. It's very inefficient, and he wants to make it better. He wants to make the Gulag system work better. So he does. She sends him electrical engineering work, so he gets the power station up and working more efficiently than it had been. He teaches some of the other prisoners working under him a little bit more about mathematics, electrical engineering, and all the rest of it. So he's like working with the system in a way, if you like. And he also retains a great deal of belief in the Soviet system. You can see the idiocies of it. You can see the horror of life in the camp. He's subjected to it every day. The cold, the damp, the poor food, the arbitrary violence. He's in particular in danger because one of the guards, this is in the book, I couldn't really put it in the book, but one of the guards is victimizing him. And he's frightened of him. And that's a real fear for a prisoner because it means they might be arbitrarily sent to one of the outer colonies where they could just die and no one would know. But it's clear that, Lev's own political background was that, he was a Komsomol member. He was a fairly standard issue Soviet person. Believed in the Soviet Union, believed in what they were doing, was a Komsomol member, believed above all in the progressive force of Soviet science. The war, I don't think shook his belief in that, but obviously the Gulag system was a major challenge to his belief system. But I think it's fair to say, and I've quoted some of the letters that suggest this, that he, and I don't think he was writing for the sense, I mean there was a period, for example, partly because of his fear of this guard, when he was trying to get himself transferred to the Volga-Don Canal, or another Gulag labour camp, where the weather was better. I mean, Pechora has pretty bad weather conditions. It's very cold in the winter, and in the summer you get bitten to death by mosquitoes. So he had heard of other prisoners getting transferred, and he thought that his expertise, not just as a physicist, but now as an electrical engineer, might help him get transferred. And you know, he speaks very positively about what the Soviet Union is doing on the Volga-Don or other projects which he must know were Gulag labour projects. Svetlana too retains this belief in the Soviet project. She is terrified by what's happening to Lev in the camps, but it's clear at the same time that, you know, as a professional leader of her research institute, which she becomes in these years of the correspondence, which is between 1946 and 1953, it's clear that she becomes a professional leader, and anyone in a position of professional leadership, as she is in her research institute, is expected to be a party member, is expected to take part in May Day celebrations, Revolution Day celebrations, to help the party organise Soviet elections, to do all the things that party activists did, and she did them. There's nothing in the uncensored correspondence to suggest anti-Soviet views, only the odd ironic comment, which is often concealed in the form of references to literature. Literature, obviously, something that the Russians were steeped in, and which they often used to, so to speak, talk between the lines. So, I mean, although there's no censorship, there is this self-censorship, because all the workers smuggling the letters in and out of the camp are taking a huge risk in doing so. And if they put down something saying Stalin is a bastard in it, this system stinks, or whatever, then the smuggler, if caught, might get into real trouble. So there are only ironic asides, often clothed in references to literary characters, to show that they sort of don't think too much of the way the Gulag systems run, that it's all pretty idiotic. Towards the end of his imprisonment in 1952, 1953, I think something very interesting happens in Lev's psychological state. I mean, there's a lot of correspondence at this time between them about how they're going to live after the camp, where they're going to live, will it be possible for them to live together, will it be possible for him to get work at all. And the letter that I'm going to ask Carl in a minute to read to you, and the context, comes, I think, in 1953, after Stalin's death on the 1st of March. A lot of criminal prisoners were given an amnesty, but the political prisoners, like Lev, were kept in the camp. But there's still a possibility of making an appeal for an amnesty, or making an appeal for a softening of the post-sentence conditions of the prisoner. When a prisoner from the Gulag is released, it's not like they just walk into freedom. They walk into the world with a passport which shows clearly that they were a prisoner. And sometimes on the passport it limits their ability to live or work in certain places, the big cities. And Svetlana had been trying to convince Lev for some time that he should appeal against his sentence, because, you know, there are already under Khrushchev now the beginnings of, reviews by the procurator of sentences. And she thinks that he should appeal against his sentence on the grounds that it was all, you know, a fit-up, obviously, but in the hope that he might be able to return to science, return to his research work. Yes, if you could come up and read it. I think maybe you might need the microphone, if you came up here and read it. No, I think people over there weren't here. So you need to, this is the wonderful Clara, who you no doubt all know. Yeah, thank you. So if you read from the top of that page.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks. And then the letter.
Que Liv aceptase que hubiese una parte de culpa y la que había hecho era una novedad en su forma de ver las cosas. En anteriores ocasiones, allá por los años 1946-1947, cuando había hablado de presentar una apelación, jamás había reconocido su culpabilidad, ni la había utilizado como argumento contra la idea de Sveta, de tratar de anular la condena que le había sido impuesta. Quizás aquellos años en el campo de trabajo lo habían doblegado hasta el punto de aceptar la injusticia que había sido objeto. Lo que sí había aprendido, desde luego, era que su situación no tenía nada de especial, había muchos como él. Me atrevería a pedir una revisión, si se diera el caso, un suponer de que pudiese presentarme como un héroe de guerra, o cuando menos me atreviese a reclamar una medalla, le explicaba Sveta el 10 de mayo. Cito: pero no es así como yo lo veo, por el contrario, considero que soy culpable, aunque no tanto como se establece en la sentencia. Si todo se hubiera reflejado y tomado en consideración como es debido, quizás me habrían caído de 5 a 3 años, tal vez menos. Pero siempre daría con algo, y con todas las consecuencias. Así están las cosas, por lo que es imposible reclamar que se haga algo como si aquí no hubiese pasado nada. ¿Qué se podría hacer? ¿Apoyándome en qué? Ahí lo tienes. Ha sido difícil para mucha gente, pero esa no es razón suficiente para ponerle las cosas más fáciles a todo el mundo. Y de ponérselas fácil a alguien, porque a mí no tengo nada especial que lo justifique. ¿Acaso porque estoy en condición de desarrollar un trabajo más importante y más útil? La verdad es que creo que puede ser más útil ejerciendo mi última profesión, electricista, que desarrollando una labor científica, o con mayor motivo, una labor de investigación. Nunca llegaría a la categoría de investigador, pero tal vez sí a la de técnico aceptable.
Thank you. So we can discuss this. I don't know. I mean, I carried out some interviews with Lev when he was still alive. He died shortly after the project began. So unfortunately, at that point, I didn't have all the letters transcribed into Russian to be able to work on that sort of issue of why did he think at the end of his life, why did he think that then he had accepted that element of guilt, even though in 46, 47 he resisted the idea that he was at all guilty. Was it that he had been sort of crushed down by the system? Was it that his expectations of life had changed? What was it that had brought him to that level? I would also have liked to question him more about the development of his political views after the Stalin period. I mean, for sure, when Stalin died, I think they celebrated in the camp. I think Lev certainly ended up at in the 2000s when I met him. He was, I'm not sure I'd say he's anti-Soviet, but he was definitely very critical of the system and thought that it was a very good thing that the system had ended. But I would like to have been able to question him more about how he reflected at the end of his life on the development of his political views then. It would have been an interesting thing to carry out. But certainly from the Khrushchev period onwards, when he's finally released, there's an evolution in his political ideas, but how far he broke out of the Soviet mindset, if we can call it that, is hard to say before 1991. That is very much the sort of issue that our team of researchers and oral historians had to deal with when we interviewed all those people for the project that culminated in my book, The Whisperers. And this is one of, I mean, it might seem as a paradox, but I don't think it really is a paradox, that many victims of repression continue to believe in the Soviet system, and indeed in Stalin, with a almost a further, and perhaps even more so as a result of their repression, than they would have done otherwise. And this is, I think, certainly true of the next person I want to focus on. Oh, I put my slides out of order. There's another picture of the Pichora labour camp, so you can see what sort of place it is. Anyway, the next person I want to speak about is Dmitry Streletsky. He's the man in the shirt and tie, seated on the far right. And Streletsky, a fairly typical story of the son of a so-called kulak, large peasant family of, I think, 12 children, and all of them denounced as kulaks, arrested, and end up with their parents in terrible conditions in a labour camp. And Dmitry is told later in life that the reason why his family had been picked for dekulakization was that they couldn't find any kulaks in their village, although they had a quota to find some, and so their family had been chosen by drawing lots. So as a result of this arrest and imprisonment in Siberia, they then end up in a penal settlement where Dmitry works as a teacher. And here he is shown as a teacher in this penal settlement. So all of those people are prisoners living under police surveillance. And he's unable, really, for a very long time in his life, to, after the death of Stalin, to get a job. He applies twice under the Khrushchev thaw when victims of repression are encouraged to apply to the party. He applies twice and fails to get into the party. But when we interviewed him in the 2000s, the way he describes his life is not as a victim of repression. He doesn't see himself in those terms. He defines himself as Soviet. He thinks that he contributed in his way to the Soviet project, and says that they always believed in Stalin during the period when he was in prison. So he says, he's asked, for example, what was your attitude towards Stalin? Very positive. As far as our family was concerned, it was very positive. I mean, they've all been arrested and their lives basically ruined by Stalin. We believed him. We believed Stalin just as much as we believed in Lenin, etc. So then we asked him in this interview, I think we kept coming back to this question of his belief in Stalin. And I think that this encouraged him maybe to think about, to reflect on it, why, he could see the contradiction himself, why he persisted in this belief in Stalin all through the years when he was in this penal settlement, when he couldn't get a job and so on. And then he volunteers this thought without being asked about why he believed in Stalin. I quote, "Perhaps all this, the faith we had, at least as I've come to see it now in recent years, I wonder whether this faith may perhaps have somehow influenced our way of thinking. That is, of those who were punished in Soviet times. Perhaps it was a way of deceiving oneself. But it was easier for us to endure. I mean, believing in Stalin's rightness, it was easier for us to endure those punishments which fell to our lot. And it also took away a bit of our fear. That's how I see it anyway." So we didn't push him to say that, he says that. And I think it's probably a very, I think it's quite a revealing explanation. He's saying that it helps rationalize what they're going through, perhaps. if they've been arrested for nothing, nie za что, as the Russians put it, then they might fall into despair. There must be some logic to what's going on, but they can't explain. And he says, again, it took away a bit of our fear. So maybe, you know, if you have some faith, as he puts it, in a rational explanation, then perhaps you're not afraid so much anymore, because let's, you know, obviously once you've been arrested, that's not the end, that's not the worst that can happen to you. It can get worse. They can add years to your sentence. They can take you out and shoot you. Anyway, I'd like also to highlight something which I think is very significant to what I want to argue in this paper, which is that, as I said before, during the Khrushchev years, he applied twice to join the party. And he got rejected both times, and the first time he was rejected, it was because he relied on someone to recommend him to join the party. This is in October 1952, the first time he was rejected, so not even under Khrushchev. He thought in October 1952 he could join the party. And someone was going to put him up for it, but then once they found out that his had spoiled biography, that he had Kulak origins, he was not going to, you know, he failed. But then again, after Stalin dies, he again tries to join the party, and again he's rejected. And so we asked him why he felt it was so important for him to become a party member, and why he felt so hurt when he was rejected. So this is what he says first. We say, does that mean that for you joining the party was the supreme goal? No, he says, but I wanted to. I was for the communists. You see, Father too had said to me, there's no reason why we should go against Soviet authority. The revolution had been a crucial moment in history. It was something inevitable, and I believed. All of us in our family believed in Soviet authority. So I wanted to be a communist. I wanted to be useful. What was I thinking, you may ask? Well, I don't deny it. It may have just been presumptuousness on my part. Anyway, I really did suffer a lot after my application fell through. It stayed with me for the rest of my life. Then we asked him, you know, I think it's clear why he was so upset. He talks about feeling anguish. And then we say, what we asked him, was joining the party actually something you wanted for yourself? To advance your career? And he said, yes, I wanted to join, I wanted to. Why? I wanted to prove, he says, that I was as much a person as everyone else. I certainly didn't have any mercenary intentions. It wasn't a question of that. I just wanted to demonstrate that I was an honest and decent person as any other person. Is this something the party could give you? Is that what you thought? Yes, the party could give me that, a clear conscience. It was from this perspective that I wanted to try to, it didn't have anything to do with my career. I wasn't concerned with that. Then we asked him later, what did the party signify for you? And he says, honour and conscience, a way of honestly, and then he says, you see, the rank and file communists were honest people. It was only over there at the top. And then he pauses, because he doesn't want to say anything incriminating. I think he still had fear of saying something then that might incriminate him. He says the rank and file communists were all honest people. And then he says later, he says somewhere, I think I've lost the quotation now, but he says at another point that he sees the party as a sort of moral vanguard. The party, if you're a member of the party, it shows that you're morally clean and you have a clear conscience. So clearly, for him, being accepted into the party is a sign that his guilt is being wiped clear. The stigma of repression is gone. Well, there are a lot of examples I could draw on about people who we might call victims of oppression, but who don't see themselves as victims of oppression, and whose response to repression is to want to become, like Streletsky, party members. In fact, there are whole cities that don't see themselves as victims of oppression. This delightful place is Norilsk. It's a city where no trees grow because the pollution is too high. The rivers are red with all the toxins that run out of the mining industry. It produces one third of the country's platinum. 1/3 of the world's platinum, sorry. There's a whole zone of Norilsk which has been closed down, like that Tarkovsky movie, Stuck Pure, where there's a zone which is dead. There's Norilsk 2, which is you can't go into, it's too poisonous. Norilsk was built in the 1940s with Gulag labor to develop the platinum industry in mining. They thought originally there was gold there. And the entire population really is made up of former Gulag prisoners and their descendants. And in 2004, we carried out an oral history project there. At the last minute, I was forbidden to go, so I had to stay behind. But I sent three researchers up there, who all came back ill. And they carried out collective interviews and also individual interviews with the inhabitants of Norilsk. Some of them the descendants or children of prisoners who've been sent there, some of them of prisoners who've become free labourers and so on. But at the first meeting, the collective group interview, when our interviews entered the room, I think about 30 interviewees who all appeared with medals and badges of honour of their achievements under the Soviet Union stood and broke into song to sing the Norilsk song, which is about the people of Norilsk being of a special brand, you know, people who are brave and courageous and strong because they can withstand the terrible conditions of Norilsk. I mean, the Arctic conditions rather than the pollution. And what was interesting about this project was that these people, whilst being, I mean, obviously fully aware of how their families had got to Norilsk, none of them really defined themselves as victims of repression. Some of them were very proud of their achievements as prisoners in the system. They thought they had contributed to the Soviet project. And this is reflected, I mean, it's a strange phenomenon really, because there's been a publishing project from Norilsk. It's called About Norilsk and the People of Norilsk. It's now, I think, 7 volumes. And it's memoirs, writings of people about their history. And although there's no denial that it's a Gulag city, the people who developed it are heroes of labour. The Bolshevik commissars who ran it as a prison system of labour are heroes of the Soviet Union. So it's as if to normalise that whole experience of a Gulag city as part of Soviet industrialisation. And that's how it's commemorated, written about with pride by the citizens. So all of this sort of narrative of the positive achievements of the Gulag population, I categorise it, I call it the Soviet narrative of suffering. So in other words, that that to give meaning to what they had gone through, these people make it positive by fitting it into a narrative of what the Soviet Union achieved. And it's a collective narrative. And it's very different from many of the intelligentsia memoirs that emerged from the Gulag experience. So memoirs of people like Nadezhda Mandelstam, Yevgeny Ginsberg, who are high-level intelligentsia types, whose narrative I've characterized by contrast as survival narratives. So in those narratives of intelligentsia types, the story is about, they're from the privileged elites of the party mostly. They're arrested, they fall into the hell of the Gulag, and then they find redemption. So in Ginsberg's memoirs, she meets a doctor who saves her and she falls in love with him, etc. So it's like a narrative of individual survival from this hell. Whereas the Soviet narrative I characterize as a collective narrative of what we achieved. My experience may have been hell, but I don't want to think of it in terms of hell. I think of it in terms of what I contributed to the Soviet project. We can discuss that. It's a very, very common phenomenon. And that's the sort of first group that I clearly concentrated on. And at the heart of it, I think, is this idea of, at its most extreme, is the idea of overcoming the stigma of repression by some sort of active participation or patriotism, Soviet patriotism. And it's a very common phenomenon among people with what we call spoilt biographies. So not necessarily they have been arrested, but their parents have been arrested, probably their father. It's, for example, one of the main reasons why often it's from the relatives of arrested people, from the relatives of enemies of the people, as they were called, that the Nkvd recruits informers. So a very typical way of recruiting an informer was for the Nkvd, the police, to call into their offices the wife of someone who's recently been arrested. And of course the wife is terrified. She might be arrested, they may threaten her family, they may evict her, they may arrest her children. They may send their children to an orphanage. So she goes along to the Nkvd offices and they say to her something like, "Are you a loyal Soviet person? Because you're under suspicion given that you failed to denounce your husband." And of course she says yes. So they say, "Well, prove it, write reports on your colleagues at work or whatever." Very, very common pattern of recruiting informers. And many people succumb to that pressure, as I think any of us would probably. And many others even went further in trying to protect themselves by not necessarily denouncing their relatives, which is pretty sort of mucky thing to do, but certainly by renouncing them once their relatives have been arrested. So it was fairly common, especially for a son, to renounce his father who had been arrested by writing to the authorities, saying he did not know. Now that he knows his father was really an enemy of the people, he renounces him and he pledges his loyalty to the Soviet system, to Stalin as his father, etc., etc. That was really very common. The archives are full of these rather formulaic letters of renunciation of enemies of the people. And even if it wasn't done formally in writing a letter to the authorities like that, it was often done inside the home, so that, for example, we came across many families where they mentioned that after the arrest of, say, the father, the family portrait, they would black out his picture from the family portrait. And it's a sort of self-protection, I guess. I guess it means that if the police come for a raid or possible arrest, they can see that the family's already blacked out the face of the enemy of the people, to disassociate themselves from his guilt. Then there's probably, if that's a very active form of, trying to overcome the stigma of repression by asserting actively a Soviet identity, then I think there's probably a much more common but difficult to detect reaction. And that is simply that people accept what happens to them, accept what happens in society. They become, if you like, conformists. They try and live quietly. They don't question anything. But as I say, it's difficult to find these people, because when you invite, as we did, thousands of people by just knowing of their existence as victims of repression, when you invite them to come forward, those aren't the sort of people who are going to come forward. The sort of people who come forward and volunteer to be interviewed are those who've got something to say. They've got a story to tell. The people who just say, well, it happened, they're less common. But there were a few, and I think this is partly, one of them was I didn't load it onto the PowerPoint, I apologise. But one of them was a fellow prisoner of Lev Mishenko in Pechora, and his name was Nikolai Lileyev. I had a picture of him as a prisoner with Mishenko. And he was on the same convoy, and he came from an educated family, and a terrible biography, really, of arrest, rearrest. He wrote these memoirs in which he sort of says, I'm a lucky man. And the memoir starts with sort of 10 sentences as to why he's a lucky man. I was arrested in this year, not that year. I wasn't killed when I was arrested. So he's like, everything is like, and when we interviewed him, he was very much like, yeah, this happened. How did it make you feel? It happened. This sort of response, monosyllabic response, everything happened, it just happened. I think that is also a Soviet phenomenon which is very common. It's just to accept that things happen without questioning them, without emotionally internalizing the effects of repression, by just saying, it happened, it happened, it happened. Maybe, I think to some extent it's a gendered response. I think it's probably more common among men than it is among women. But, we haven't got enough research to know that for sure. So these are the various responses. Resistance, I think, was pretty, resistance, there's this individual narrative of survival, for sure, but I think among ordinary people that is not a narrative that was often told after the experience of repression. But certainly resistance was pretty exceptional. I want to come to her later. Yeah, this guy, Lev Neto, is one of my heroes. He is an exception. I can talk about him later. He was the younger brother of the man you see in the photo in his cabinet there, who was Igor Neto, who was the captain of the Soviet football team. And while he was going around the world being a hero, Lev was in the same prison camp that I mentioned before, Norilsk. He was in this place. And he'd been arrested there, like Lev, in Filtrovka. But the war had been a sort of eye-opener for him. He'd been in an American prisoner of war camp towards the end of the war, and he says one of the big things that had changed, had opened his eyes to the Soviet system was a time when he was in this American prisoner of war camp, and a group of American soldiers came back, and they all threw their gun onto a pile of guns and then went off to eat in the canteen. And Lev Neto couldn't believe what he was seeing, because in the Soviet army, if you came back from a day's fighting without your gun or gave up your gun, you'd be shot, literally. The gun, in other words, in the Soviet army was more important than the man, whereas in the American army he'd learned the man was more important than the gun. Anyway, the point is that he did learn to resist, and in the Norilsk labor camp, he fell into a group of prisoners who by this stage in the late 1940s, many of them came from Ukraine, Latvia, Baltic states, and were not frightened of death. They'd been through the war. And they tried to make sense of this system that they had believed in perhaps before the war. By what could they do? The only thing they could read to try and make sense of the system was the works of Marx and Engels and Lenin. So they went to the Gulag library and started reading the works of Marx and Engels and Lenin and formed, as Lenin had taught them to, an underground party, an underground resistance group. And they led the one of the biggest uprisings within the Gulag system, the Norilsk uprising of spring of May 1953. And so I think Neto is exceptional in that sense and a real hero because he's without the ability to without the information to question the system, he's learning through experience about the system and learning to organise with others in a way to resist it. But that's really very exceptional, and so it raises the points I want to bring for discussion. I'm moving towards a close. I know I've spoken for quite a long time. I'm moving towards a close now. I've probably got 5 or 10 minutes left. Because I think all of these issues I've raised bring us to the question of Soviet identity and how far people were Sovietized, whether people could think outside the Soviet box, so to speak. And I differ here, I think, from the dominant trend in historiography these days, which is the fashionable Foucault-driven, theoretically driven by Foucault, ideas of the construction of the personality, and people like Helbeck and Halfin and others have what is called developed what is called the Soviet subjectivity school. And basically the idea of this is that people they're reacting against the revisionist school of historiography, of people like Sheila Fitzpatrick and others, who argued on the basis of social history, really, that people developed a vested interest in the Soviet system in the 1930s because it offered them upward mobility, it offered them jobs. So there was a sort of materially based relationship between Soviet individual trajectories of personal advancement and the progress of the Soviet Union as a whole. And Helbeck and Halfin and others in this school say this isn't enough. We think there was also a genuine belief in the system, and if you look at what people wrote in terms of their autobiographies, I mean, they're looking at things like Nkvd. When you applied for a job, when you applied to go to university or college, when you applied for anything in the Soviet Union, you had to write down all sorts of biographical information. And so people became accustomed to sort of making their biography as proletarian as possible. I am the son, if you're a son of a kulak, you'd probably be tempted and may risk writing, I am the son of a poor peasant. Or if you're the son of an aristocrat whose position was brought down by the revolution and they ended up being office workers, you wouldn't say I'm the son of an aristocrat, you'd say I'm the son of an office worker. So people were doing this all the time. Anyway, on the basis of this sort of autobiographical writing and the diaries that have emerged, these historians argue that basically people were unable to break out of the Soviet discourse. And Helbeck in particular has focused on the diary of someone called Stepan Podlubny, who, like Streletsky, was the son of a kulak, supposedly kulak, with a spoilt biography, but who wanted to get on. He joins the Pravda print work. He's trying to conceal his biography. He's trying to become Soviet. And he uses this diary, as he puts it, to work on himself, to try and purge himself of anti-Soviet thoughts. And in his interpretation of this diary, Hellbeck argues that he sees any disjunction between himself and the collective way of thinking as a sort of sickness that he wants to cure. He wants to belong to the collective so strongly that he's prepared. But this purging, this working on himself, this trying to reconcile himself with the system in a way that makes him part of the system, comes under growing pressure in the 1930s and finally breaks when his mother's arrested. Hellbeck's interpretation of the diary is rather controversial. I don't want to touch on that. I just want to say that my own understanding, I'm sure that some of this working on yourself was there. I think we have to, though, be careful about interpreting too much from diaries. Diaries are pretty exceptional as artifacts. As I suggested, Hellbeck's interpretation of this particular diary is even questionable. When he then interviewed Podlubny, who'd given his diary to an archive, Podlubny didn't recognise Hellbeck's interpretation of the diary. He sort of said, no, that's not what I was saying at all. So the perception of what people are doing at the time in their diary may be very different from what they were doing at the time. Or maybe what we read into the diary is not what they had meant at the time. Who knows? I think it's rather difficult to say. All of these sources and testimonies have problems of their own. But in my experience working with over 400 families and all the materials we generated from them, I think, although there may have been Podlubnys who were trying to purge themselves in this manner and were unable to break out of the Soviet way of thinking and anguished by that inability, I think that much more common was a sort of dual identity, a sort of a double life. People led double lives, and they led double lives so naturally that they didn't even notice it. So I think Svetlana, when she was going on a parade for the party while her loved one was in the Gulag, she was leading a double life. She probably wasn't even aware that there was a contradiction there, because she probably thought of going on a May Day demonstration as part of her professional responsibilities. She didn't see it as a political act necessarily. And I think people often talk about leading this double life, and I think people were able to shift between one mode of thinking and behaviour and another mode of thinking and behaviour very easily. They've been brought up that way. Children in the Soviet period were brought up, not to say anything about private life outside the home. There was the expression, the walls have ears. So children knew, I think, and were, for their own protection, were brought up to be very careful about what they said to whom. And that becomes so natural, I think, to people that they switch in and out in these different modes of behaviour without even thinking. And I still recognise it in Russians today. And so I want to close by talking about a different type of Kulak child, who's in a way another hero, which is this woman here, who begins and ends, sorry, that's her parents and brother. She was born Antonina Golovina to this family, who were, like so many millions of others, arrested and deported to Siberia as kulaks during collectivization. And Antonina herself goes, her father's arrested, goes to work on one of the Gulag labour camp work sites, and she and 3 or 4 of her brothers and sisters and her mother go to Siberia, and where they're just like many other kulaks, just dumped on a penal set. There's nothing there. It's the middle of a forest on a river clearing, they're just dumped there, so get on with it. So they, try and survive by living off fruit and berries and mushrooms, and they chop down trees to build themselves housing. Terrible conditions, lots of them died. But Antonina and family survived to the point where they then, after 3 years of exile, returned not to their original village Pestovo in the north of Russia, but to a town not far from that really, where a lot of kulaks had ended up. And here is Antonina on the left at the front. She's the only child there not to be a member of the pioneers. You can see, yeah, she's excluded from the pioneers because she's from a kulak family. And the teacher at one point victimizes her in class by denouncing her in front of the class, saying that all the kulaks should have been killed. So you can imagine, I should have a very forceful, real sense of, I mean, her values had come from her father really, and that very, she spent a lot of time in interview talking about how she was brought up to believe in hard work, that you know, because that was who the kulaks were. The kulaks were the most successful, hard-working, most sober peasants. And that's how she was brought up. And she had ambition and she wanted to be a doctor. And so she followed the example of her sister during the war years when, you know, checking on people's Nkvd, checking on people's identity was not so strict. She did what many kulak children did at that point. She ran the risk of buying forged papers, false papers. And with those false papers, she went at the age of 18 to Leningrad and qualified as a doctor, as a medical student. And at the end of the war, terrified still that she may be, you know, that her true biography may be revealed, she marries a man called Znamensky, lives with him until they divorced for about 20 years. And all that time didn't tell him anything about her spoilt biography, assumed that her husband had a clean biography. But then, after they had been divorced for a while, a relative of his turns up, and it transpires that he too had a spoilt biography. He was the son of a Tsarist naval officer who'd been shot in 1917. And he'd lived his whole life with his biography written down as a false biography, so that he kept it in his pocket, so that when he had to fill out all these forms, he would not make a slip. He would always get it right according to his invented biography. So they lived intimately as a man and wife all this time, concealing from each other the fact that both of them had spoilt biographies. And they didn't tell their daughter anything about their spoilt biographies after they had discovered that they both shared this history. And Antonina herself, and she talks about basically having to live this life of subterfuge, that it was all conscious. And then she let slip, because we didn't realise it, she let slip that at some point she joined the party. And she sees that we're all surprised. So she says, now when I later set my mind on getting into the party, brackets, notices the interviewer's lack of surprise, and then she says, oh yes, what's so strange about that? You see, it was when I had just defended my thesis and started being paid my junior researcher's salary, and so she decided she wanted to join the party, and she did. And then again, like with Streletsky, she justifies, rationalizes why she joined the party in many different ways. She's quite explicit about it. She says she did it for material purposes. She says she joined the party as a conscious act of subterfuge because she knew that joining the party would advance her career and make her life more easy. She went on party propaganda marches. She was an activist for the party. All the time, she claims, not believing in communism in the least, just as an act of subterfuge. And then, Then, again, a bit like Streletsky, clearly this has been going on in her mind while she's being interviewed all these hours and days. She then breaks the interview, which is about something completely different. And she says this: "There's one thing I would like to add about my decision to join the party. Yes, there was the reason of my career, nothing unusual there, I should think. But apart from that, I was also very worried about my daughter's future. I didn't want her at all to know anything about our family's past. I wanted her to feel that her mother was just like all the other parents of the children at her school, which was one of those special schools with a focus on English. The parents were all, of course, party members, or at least the fathers were, and I wasn't. And I had to explain that to her when, as early as in her second form, she started asking me about, you see, she said that in the school, the second form, well, she says, why aren't you in the party? Everyone else has a daddy in the party. And so she says that's also why she joined. Okay, so I'm not sure, how much credence does one give to this testimony? That she played the system all this time, consciously. Difficult to say. I mean, maybe she did sort of gradually begin to believe in the party, or she, and now that the party is over, now she says, I never believed in the party. Possibly. We'll never know. I mean, she's passed away a long time ago now. In that book, in The Whispers, I had many moments when I felt, well, how, as a team of interviewers, there are many moments when we felt, how hard do we shake this person to try and get them, or is there any point in shaking them to try and get them to change their story or say, okay, the truth is this, blah, blah, blah. In the end, I think, you have to make that judgment to shake or not to shake. And in this case, I felt, it's her story. This is how she wants to tell her story. Let her tell it in her own terms. Okay, I'll stop there. I think I've opened it up enough, hopefully, for some questions.
Muchas gracias, Orlando, por tu presentación. Ahora vamos a abrir una ronda de preguntas que vamos a hacerla con micrófono para que los traductores puedan traducirle al profesor. Cristina, y don Eduardo, y Igor, y aquí, y después yo. Para quedar aquí.
Can we get the lights up?
¿Ah?
The lights up?
Sí, la luz para que la... Sí, que ponga el audio.
Oh, yes, of course, yeah.
Minutito más.
Bueno,
Sí, dale.
yo quisiera hacer dos preguntas que tienen que ver con este proceso de construcción de la memoria de la represión estalinista en Rusia. Uno tiene que ver con cómo la narrativa de la memoria de la represión estalinista dialoga, se contrapone o particulariza un tipo particular de represión en relación, por ejemplo, a la otra gran narrativa de la represión, que es el Holocausto. Pregunto esto porque hay varios autores que enfatizan que el Holocausto se construyó en la gran narrativa de comprensión de todos los actos represivos y de construcción de totalitarismo en el mundo, digamos. ¿De qué manera la construcción de la memoria soviética, digamos, sobre la represión del estalinismo articula un modelo distinto o no tan distinto, digamos, de la construcción de la narrativa del Holocausto? Esa es mi primera pregunta. La segunda pregunta tiene que ver con qué procesos posterior, digamos, a la caída de la Unión Soviética han ido reconfigurando la memoria de los gulag en los espacios que no eran rusos, es decir, qué pasa con los espacios que conformaron parte de la Unión Soviética y que también vivieron sus experiencias de represión, y cómo ellos incorporan elementos o narrativas distintivas respecto del Gulag en Rusia propiamente tal.
Thank you. Can I take, I know Eduardo has a question, but can I take Christina's first? Is this fine?
Yeah.
I'll take Eduardo's
No, it's okay because I'm going to make a comment.
Okay. Fine.
¿Cómo
Go
puedo
ahead.
dar mi
Dale, Eduardo.
No, very briefly, hablo en castellano mejor.
Sí, dale.
Muy brevemente, yo estuve en el año 1969 como estudiante, yo estudiaba en Francia en ese tiempo. La excepcional experiencia de ir a la Unión Soviética. Fuimos con un grupo de estudiantes de la Universidad de París y estuvimos en Moscú y en Leningrado. Allí, naturalmente, con toda nuestra inquietud juvenil y además porque veníamos saliendo de la experiencia del 68 en Francia, entonces estábamos absolutamente motivados por saber qué es lo que pasaba en la Unión Soviética. Nos movilizamos, tomamos contacto especialmente con el mundo estudiantil soviético. Nos fuimos, me acuerdo, en Leningrado, nos fuimos a la universidad directamente a hablar con los estudiantes. Ahora, ¿qué nos encontramos ahí? Nos encontramos un mundo juvenil, estudiantil, profundamente interesado en saber lo que estaba pasando en Occidente, porque hasta ese momento había habido un bloqueo sistemático de las comunicaciones. Recién comenzaba en ese tiempo a verse una televisión internacional, a verse programas de televisión internacional que procedían de Occidente. En consecuencia, ellos estaban absolutamente motivados por conocer qué es lo que pasaba entre la juventud en Occidente, y querían incorporarlo. Anécdotas tontas, por ejemplo, yo andaba de jeans en ese tiempo, entonces mucho interés en comprarme los jeans porque las tiendas eran horrorosas. Las tiendas de Moscú había por ejemplo, montañas de zapatos negros que era lo que correspondía a ese año vender, ¿no? Entonces al comercio. Bueno, eso entonces creó una situación, una compañía, una colaboración muy interesante, y me acuerdo contrastando con el sistema que existía. Invitamos a un grupo de jóvenes de la universidad a una convivencia con nosotros en el hotel. Nosotros estábamos en un hotel frente a la histórica estación de Finlandia en Leningrado. Los invitamos entonces a comer algo, y estábamos en lo mejor de la reunión cuando llegaron las guardias, eran guardias femeninas del hotel, y los expulsaron inmediatamente porque no estaban autorizados para tener contactos con gente de Occidente. Una cosa absolutamente chocante. Ahora, algo mencionaste tú, you mentioned something about people, sobre gente viniendo con todas sus medallas, o sea, la burocracia. Ellos venían en las tardes al hotel a cócteles, ¿no? Y a convivir un poco ahí con los turistas que venían de Occidente, y venían todos con sus medallas y con sus distinciones físicas, ¿no? de lo que habían vivido. Bueno, eso y muchas cosas que vivimos allá nos sorprendieron mucho. Cuando volví a Chile, fui invitado a algunas actividades, estaba ya en el mundo académico, y debo decir que fui acusado directamente de ser agente de la CIA por las cosas que contaba. Y no me acuerdo de una reunión en la Universidad de Viña, no, en la Universidad de Valparaíso. Fui acusado por revelar estas cosas, por decir estas cosas. Yo no sabía, me dijo un colega de aquí, yo no sabía que tú eras agente nazi. Bueno, una pequeña contribución, a little contribution of what you said about this, because eso es una experiencia personal que me tocó vivir en the 1960s. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for that comment. And yes, I mean, I had similar.
Queremos quiero juntar las preguntas. La primera,
Sí, pero él quería contestarle
¿quiere
primero a
contestar
la
primero?
Cristina y después continuar con la otra
Ya.
ronda de preguntas.
usted, ¿cuál es que le
No, continúa. Continue. You
Okay,
have to write
okay,
Cristina.
fine. Yes, on the first point about the contrast between the Holocaust and the Soviet process of recuperating memories, I think going back to a point I made yesterday, the issue I would stress is that the formation of memories and the narrative or formation of the Holocaust is one in which the collective memory was very, very active. As you know, it was really only after, well, really from the early 1960s that the structures were placed by the trials, the Eichmann trial, most importantly, and then the work of Hollywood as much as anything in sort of creating a collective memory structure for people to come forward and actively remember the Holocaust in a narrative that was clear. I mean, no one can really explain the Holocaust. It's sort of too big for anyone to explain, but it's there. It's there. People have that structure to place the Holocaust memories in. But I think that a little bit like the Soviet situation, which is so different, before that, I don't think Holocaust survivors had a very easy time of talking about it. I know this from my own family's experience, who are Holocaust survivors, that they probably, for the most part, took the view the best thing to do is just forget it. Just forget it. And so that was because there was no sort of active collective memory with a sort of narrative they could identify with in order to relate their personal experiences in a way that was meaningful. If we then turn to the Soviet case, it's a very different one we're dealing with, because there's no, the people we interview have some sort of structure, because they are all identifying themselves, in the case of my work with Memorial, as members of Memorial. And Memorial, as a human rights organisation, was set up at a time for victims of repression, at a time in the 1990s, or late 1980s and early 1990s, when it was almost, when there was no shame in being identified as a victim of repression, when people were being encouraged to come forward with this, and when indeed the Russian constitution had this thing they called moralny ущерб, so the moral damage to these people, which would supplement their income by tiny amount, they weren't rich, they used a tiny amount, but it was a symbolic payment which encouraged people to come forward. And they also had a sort of narrative to place their individual memories, because at this time, in the late 80s and 1990s, the work of people like Solzhenitsyn was being published, and Ginsberg and Manson, they're all appearing, so they could identify their story with this narrative of, mainly a narrative of survival, and to the point where actually many people confuse their individual memories. They identified so strongly with the Solzhenitsyn story that they almost sublimated their own individual memories in the Solzhenitsyn narrative. So we came across lots of cases of people saying something happened to them and actually they'd read about it in Solzhenitsyn. But that process of the development of a sphere of collective memory in which people can make sense of their individual memories, it didn't last very long. It only really lasted from, say, 1987 to... By the late 1990s, society's already bored of this story. Enough of repression. No, we don't want to hear any more about repression. So, and then under Putin, because television stations, newspapers don't want to deal with it at all. So basically, if you think about what happened in Germany, it happens over a long period, it happens over decades, and there's a very active, constructive role being played by the state and by other universities, by organizations, Holocaust memorial groups and stuff, who are all encouraging more and more sophisticated understanding in which people can relate with. And in Russia, there's basically Solzhenitsyn, a few more memoirs. Memorial is a very marginal organization. It doesn't really have much influence. So it's basically all, there's not a big space there for people to work in. And so it's probably, not going to be developed. I mean, we interviewed a lot of people, but those people now are all dead. So I think there's a real danger in Russia now that because these memories didn't find a place in collective memory, there's a real danger, I think, that this whole story of the Gulags is forgotten. Literally. That in 50 years' time, they'll still be commemorating 9th of May 1945. But the Gulag, what was that? Oh yeah, like maybe the British remember slavery a long time ago. Yeah? It's like, past the past. So that's quite likely, I think, to happen because of this failure of the collective memory sphere. And then there's another factor which I think relates to your second very interesting point, which was about the relationship between the way Russians remember it and non-Russians remember it. And that again is that if you're Latvian or Ukrainian, you can explain this, put this into a narrative. This is what the Russians did to us. So it's particularly politicized in Ukraine because of the Holodomor, the famine, the terror famine of 32-33, which is for the Ukrainians an act of genocide against Ukrainians. And that gives people a very clear structure in which to relate their experience. And again, like the Holocaust, it's given lots of encouragement by the state, which finances research organizations, publications, oral history projects, the disclosure of archival documents, all to reinforce this narrative that Ukraine was a victim of genocide by Russia. Complicated, whether it's genocide or not. I think by Raphael Lemkin's original definition of genocide, it was a genocide, but the nature of the genocide, is open to debate. But by contrast with that, what do the Russians do? Who do they blame? They have no one to blame. They can only blame Russians. Even among the Russians, the membership of Memorial, right? Memorial represents victims of repression, right? But the victims of repression weren't just people like Antonino Galavino, whose family had led an innocent life until then. The victims of repression were also Bolsheviks. They were also the leaders of Gulag labor camps. They were also members of Nkvd, etc., etc. So many of the persecutors become victims. So that's an added confusion. Whereas with the Holocaust, everyone can say, who were the victims? Jews. Okay, homosexual, communists too, but basically Jews. Who were the perpetrators? Mr. Hitler and the Nazis. in post-Soviet Russia, it's not clear at all. Who are the victims? All of us. Who are the perpetrators? All of us. Because everybody, to some degree, collaborated with the system. If you were to put the perpetrators on trial, it would be very difficult to say, well, those people, Stalin responsible, Beria responsible, Yezhov responsible, I mean, all Kaganovich responsible. But, I mean, how far down do you go? Do you include people who informed? And if you include people who informed, do you include those people who informed out of malice or out of the belief that they were doing their patriotic duty? People who informed unknowingly? People who informed because they were frightened? Well, who's guilty? Everyone's guilty. Because you could say some people are guilty because they went along with it. They didn't resist it. So this is the problem. And for Russia it's very difficult to find a process by which they sort of develop a narrative that enables memories to help this what I call a post-traumatic society. I think Russia's a post-traumatic society. There's no clear narrative they can use for that, and that means that they're trapped by this history in a way that is poisonous and poisons the politics of Russia.
Professor Volkovich.
Oh.
Siguiendo en la línea de lo último que señalaste, y me parece que es interesante también hacerse cargo de que un sistema político, cualquiera que este sea, busca legitimarse a través de los procesos educativos, los sistemas de educación. Y en ese sentido, la experiencia de la Unión Soviética en la década de 1930 está en alguna medida marcada por lo que se conoce como el mito de Pavlik Morozov. Y mirado desde esa perspectiva, me gustaría saber qué incidencia tiene el mito de Pavlik Morozov y la denuncia, por lo tanto, como un elemento fundamental a efecto de construir una nueva sociedad que rompe, que desgarra toda relación con el pasado.
So, for those who don't know it, the myth of Pavlik Morozov is the story of this so-called pioneer boy. He wasn't actually a pioneer, but he supposedly denounced his father as a kulak during the collectivization campaign, and then and stood up in court saying that he didn't recognize him as his father. He was a kulak. He's therefore an enemy of the state. And he was then killed by relatives. The story, I mean, no one, it's a very difficult story to disentangle the truth from all the legends, but the point is that the legend built up by Gorky and others became very, very influential. They made a film, they were pioneers, were supposed to make Pavlik Morozov a hero. And I always insisted with the interviews we did with Memorial that they always ask about Pavlik Morozov. And it elicited some interesting responses, and in general I would say people were uncomfortable talking about Pavlik Morozov, because although at one level they could say, yes, Pavlik Morozov, it was also silly, didn't believe it, it was a silly story, etc. The theme of the sense of guilt people have when their father, say, has disappeared forever, can communicate itself in all sorts of ways, and the Pavlik Morozov story can touch off emotions because it's a story of renunciation as well as a story of denunciation. So I'm sure these are issues in Chile today as well, with the disappeared and all the rest, but it's, in the Soviet case, which I know a little bit more about, I could say, probably I could risk to say that that when, for example, someone had a father who'd been arrested and had then gone on to become a full Soviet person, joining the professions maybe, and maybe just not even thinking about their arrested father that much because they weren't encouraged to think about them other than as a good father who disappeared. They weren't told very much about their father. They didn't learn very much about their father because there wasn't very much to learn, or because their relatives didn't want to burden them with too much knowledge about their father other than the fact that they were a good father. Maybe because the relatives weren't sure, was the father guilty or innocent? Was there something the father had done that had got him into trouble? They didn't know themselves. So many people who grew up with this biography and then had say a full Soviet career, I don't know, as an engineer, a teacher or whatever, and then after 1991, with all what they see in television about the repressions and all this stuff, some emotions are stirred. And then when you ask them, how did you react to the Pavlik Morozov story, it's uncomfortable for them. And they don't understand fully why or how it's uncomfortable for them, perhaps. But there's a slight discomfort that they've lived, never fully coming to terms with what happened to their father, or trying to find out what happened to their father. They can't find out what happened to their father because maybe there's something in that KGB archive, but they don't want to go to the KGB archive. And even if they went to the KGB archive, there's this, a protocol of arrest, a paper of rehabilitation. That's it. That's all there is. There's nothing. There's nothing there. So what's that going to do for them? Yeah. So this memory of their father is problematic. Because there's a sense that, in a way, maybe they renounce them because they forgot about them. These are the issues, and so it's rather difficult to sort of characterise what's going on there. You would need psychological treatment to get it out, and that's not available. And these people are all gone. But I think it's there's level. What I think it suggests is that repression. And I think this is the big thing we learned out of this project. That the repression is not. Repression comes down many generations, and it doesn't dissolve in the bigger culture. It remains there over several generations, and transforms into many different emotions that are hard to characterize.
Yo quiero hacer una pregunta a Orlando. Primero, uno, que pueda sintetizar brevemente, ¿no? Su posición. ¿La identidad soviética fue genuina o fue por conveniencia? Que pudiera hacer una síntesis de lo que él nos dijo. Yo que como que se juegue por una opción, ¿no? Segundo, quería preguntarle por el caso de Konstantin Simonov, autor de muchas novelas, ¿no? Y como novelista oficial de Stalin en una época. Escribió un libro que se llama Nadie soldado al nacer, y de los vivos a los muertos, que son 2 volúmenes, son una obra magna, como debe ser unas 2000 páginas, y que en el libro Los que susurran es tal vez el gran protagonista del libro, porque está presente en su historia desde el principio hasta el final. Y que el hombre pasa por ser un tipo que asciende en la jerarquía soviética, que finalmente se vuelve un escritor oficial, incluso hay un caso pareciera ser de que él denunció a algún colega, y termina siendo un disidente. Entonces, un poco que nos pueda contar brevemente sobre su opinión sobre la figura de Simonov. Y por último, una cosa como del oficio, es cómo preparó a su equipo de encuestadores, porque en el libro los que susurran, si no me equivoco, eran 500 las entrevistas, y se repartieron por Rusia un ejército de entrevistadores, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cómo preparó este equipo? ¿Cuál era la fórmula, digamos, la estrategia?
In fact, so there's 3 points. Let me address the last first, the methodology of the project. At the time I approached Memorial, 2003, when I had a grant to do this, I don't think they had any experience at that point of interviewing people about internal life. They had done their oral history projects until that point, mainly about the facts of imprisonment, arrest, and so on. Asking them questions about emotional life, about belief, about relationships inside the family, and so on, was something they hadn't been accustomed to at all. So I think they would acknowledge that they benefited from the experience of doing that. But we were working also in a context where the oral history wasn't very developed in Russia. I mean, it had not existed really in the Soviet Union. It was not part of the academy in any way. It was individual memories were too inconvenient for the narrative of Soviet historiography. So those are the problems. But I met with a team of researchers, of interviewers, and talked them through what I was trying to get at. I think they understood. I think it was trial and error in the sense that when they took the first, I mean, as in all history projects these days, I think the first interview was just you switch the tape recorder on and you say, tell us about your life, and you let them tell the story as they want to tell it, and let them shape their own narrative. And then basically it was trial and error and training in the sense that then once I had the transcript of that first, often very long interview, I'd meet with the interviewer and discuss what came out of it, what we should pursue for the second interview, and I saw that as basic training really. I don't think you can be too strict about the sort of, we had a list of questions that I was interested in, but I don't think you can be too strict about you've got to ask this before that, and etc. I think every interview in oral history projects depends on the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee. These are something that I can't control not being there. I didn't have time to go to 500 homes. I had my own I had my own families to work with above all the Seminov archive, but I had about 20 families of my own I worked with, many of them living abroad, not in Russia at all. So I trusted them to sort of talk through with me the issues that they felt, and then there were a lot of issues about, as I said, how hard do you shake people, which avenues do you pursue, etc. So that's how the training worked. You asked me to synthesize and come down one way or another about something. Here I am trying to give a nuanced, sophisticated, complicated picture, and you're asking me to now paint it all black or all white. So I'm not going to do that. But I think it's that. Yeah, I think we can talk about something called the Soviet identity, in the sense of identification with the Soviet system. I think it exists. I think that it manifests itself in different ways. So I think for Lev Mishenko, the first person I'm talking about, it probably was centered on the idea of science rather than politics, or that he saw politics through the prism of science. For someone who's in the army, it might, and I think this was true of Simonov to some extent, it's through the prism of the military. So it's like a many-sided identity. It doesn't mean if you believe like Streletsky did in the Soviet system, I believed in the Soviet system, he kept saying, that doesn't mean to say you necessarily believe in Stalin, but you believe in what's around you. You believe in socialism in some abstract form. You believe in the society you exist in. You believe in the revolution, maybe. I'm not sure that by the 1940s is too important, but you believe in the leadership, in what they're trying to achieve. So there is that. I think it exists, it's an entity, but it's got many sides to it, many different levels of engagement. You can be skeptical of it at the same time as believing it. On Simonov, yes, Simonov is a fascinating figure. He's the main sort of figure that I worked with, and I didn't know what to do with Simonov in the book. Whispers is like he's Alexei Simonov's Kirill, or Konstantin as he was known, Simonov's son, who was my main point of contact to the family, sort of described it as, well, as I say, Orlando, he says, you've got this big swimming pool, and there are all these people swimming around in it, all these people you're interviewing, then you want to chuck my father into it as well. So, I mean, that's what we sort of did, really. I could have done Simonov as a book on his own. But I thought that what Simonov gave to the book, which is so fascinating, is a really close-up view of someone who's compromised by the system. Simonov is from a Obolenska family. His mother's aristocrat, who, as I said, like many others, she becomes secretary in the Soviet office after 1917. So he proletarianizes himself in his biography, in his Nkvd, to become a proletarian writer in the 1930s. He writes in praise of the Belomor Canal, the first Gulag project. He writes in praise of Stalin. In the war, he becomes this world-famous figure, mainly for his poem Жди меня, Wait for Me, which voiced sort of many soldiers' emotions about fighting in order to return home for their sweethearts. And then he, post-war, becomes a really senior figure in the Writers' Union and takes part in an active way in the so-called anti-cosmopolitan campaign against Jews, in which many of his friends lost jobs. And he did some pretty shameful things, writing plays which were very much peddling the sort of Stalinist propaganda line in the Cold War and so on. And then, right at the end of his life, on his deathbed, really dictated this fascinating memoir, The Person Through the Человек за глазами, what's it called? I can't remember. Anyway, it's like he's interrogating his life and himself through various prisms of perception. And I had access through Alexei, his son, to the family archive. I think other parts of the family deeply regretted that I had access to this, and it led me into some very, very difficult situations with other members of the family who didn't know things that I did, and so that's an awkward thing about dealing with private life as a historian. But I think, in answer to your question, what fascinates me about Simonov, I mean, there's some people who would take the view, as one of my reviewers did, well, Simonov, he was just a scoundrel who then felt guilty later. But that doesn't take away from the fact that he was a scoundrel. And I don't see it that way. I think Simonov, he had relatives arrested. He was a young, ambitious man, undoubtedly. And he joined the party, did all the things that was asked of him to advance his career. But I think he felt some real ambiguity about what he was doing, particularly with a Jewish playwright and critic called Bolshakovsky, whom I interviewed. And I think he was, he was a very conflicted sort of person. I think, and what does a person do who feels a certain level of guilt at a certain level about how they're living their lives, about what compromises they're making to continue in the way they do? They don't denounce themselves, they just go on. They just go on and do the best they can, I guess, and at the same time, don't want to give up too much. I mean, Bolshakovsky's view, I think, was that to have acted as Simonov did in 1948 didn't have so many consequences as it would have if he'd acted in that way in 1937. Because in 1937, if you act as perhaps your conscience says you should act, you pay for it with your life. Whereas if in 1948 you say, I'm not going to do this. The order comes from Stalin to Simonov to make a speech against cosmopolitans. And Simonov says, okay, I'll make the speech, because if I don't make it, then someone worse than me, like Sofronov, will make it, and it'll be even worse. So that's how he rationalizes to himself what he does. So, you know, that's bad, but I mean, which one of us could say, hand on heart, they would be the brave one and say, I'm not going to make this speech? I don't think I could. I don't think any of us could say, I would have acted better. So, for me, this is the real, you know, this gets to the heart of the Soviet system. It acts, you know, it asks for compromise, you make a compromise. It may ask for another compromise, you make the other compromise. It doesn't ask for you to do one big thing. It asks you to compromise, compromise, compromise. And then I think, like Simonov, you lose yourself in the system. You're lost. And there's no way of climbing out of that. I think that's how the system works. So in that sense, I think Simonov, yeah, he's a scoundrel, but I think at the end of the day, we're probably all scoundrels.
Está la señora Magdalena y luego...
Sí, muchas gracias de toda esta importante exposición. Me parece que hay tres conceptos fundamentales, que sería la narrativa, la memoria y un poco, digamos, las estructuras psicológicas, mentales. Y ese trabajo está fundamentalmente centrado en la Unión Soviética. Sin embargo, tal vez se podría un poco jugar o trabajar desde las estructuras, sobre todo, si esta manera de actuar es un tema de la Unión Soviética o de una cultura de más larga duración, que se hizo en el zarismo con la narrativa para justificar, digamos, qué se hace hoy frente a Chechenia. No se vuelve a justificar también que lo importante es la razón de Estado, etcétera, cualquier tipo de excesos, ¿no? Entonces creo que es una sociedad, y solamente un comentario respecto a una visita hace poco a Rusia, en la que, por ejemplo, me decían que en el tema de la memoria, porque hay muchos historiadores luchando por recuperar la memoria, y que a alguien le interesa la celebración de los 100 años, no le interesa a mucha gente, que hay como una lógica de barrer, de silenciar, más larga que lo que fue la URSS.
Yes, I mean, you're right, there are deeper cultural aspects probably at work. And other historians have focused on some of those. So, for example, the historical sociologist Nkvd has written a book about, I think it's called The Collective and the Individual, and it's about Soviet identity and how the sort of culture works. And he makes a lot of the similarities between the functioning of the Orthodox Church and the functioning of Soviet political culture. So the fact, for example, that confession in the Orthodox tradition is in the open, not in a box, as in the Catholic Church, is like already part of something one could link with the culture of self-censorship at collective meetings, the culture of the purge, which is, I mean, the word for purge, the word to get to the truth of the purge is razоблачение. You разоблачить somebody, which means that you get to what's inside their head. So that is actually one of the reasons why confession was thought to be the highest level of evidence in a court, not something suspicious. Because in the Western tradition of confession, or the Western tradition of conscience, it's a private matter, whereas in the Soviet tradition, what's in your head is supposed to be open to society. So there's this culture of surveillance, there's this culture of the private life of certainly a party member being a matter of public interest. or of collective interest to the party. So at meetings of self-censorship, a party member would be questioned about his behaviour at home. And so what's internal is supposed to be open to. So there's something in that. I think it's hard to, I don't think it's something you can really pursue in a series of interviews. I think the culture of denunciation, which was in there, the culture before 1917, the culture of writing to the Tsar for remedies to abuse and all the rest, the culture of monarchy worship, if you like, the holy Tsar and all of this, all of these sort of long political cultural elements feed into the Soviet system. But I think, you know, it's quite, I think we all need to be aware of those cultural elements, but I think it's rather difficult to sort of pin them down as agents of actual behaviour.
Bien.
Una consulta sobre este tema de la conciencia contradictoria. ¿Cómo reaccionaron los que están en la Gulag que reaccionaron que tenían como pensamiento de orgullo o algo así, que lo hicieron bien, cuando comenzaron a hablar de la sublevación organizada por los neoleninistas? ¿Cómo reaccionan? ¿Dijeron, yo no sé nada de eso? ¿O dijeron que eran traidores? ¿O cómo porque están enfrentando ahí los dos lados de la memoria contradictoria? ¿Cómo reaccionaron?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question in the sense that it's, I don't think we know enough about the formation of this narrative and how Gulag prisoners came to that view after their release, or whether it was already part of their narrative when they were prisoners. I don't think we know enough. My sense of how that narrative is formed is that when sorry, I'm cold again. I'm going to put this on. When prisoners are released, they're isolated. They feel isolated because they're isolated sometimes even from their own families, because they are afraid of telling them what happens to them for fear that they won't understand, or because they feel guilty before them for having let them down, or because they don't want to burden them with their story. And this means that actually the most common form of collective group for prisoners after their release is other prisoners. So the fact that Golovina married someone who also had a sport biography, I think is probably significant. People pick up people that they can trust. But in the case of Gulag prisoners, there's also the element that I think what I learned from, one of the things I learned from working on the letters is that the support system for Lev in prison was not just Svetlana sending him letters and parcels, moral support, and in fact, those who've read the book will know she actually smuggles herself into the camp to visit him. It's the fact that they have a huge support network of friends. So when someone like Strelkov falls ill in the camp, Lev sends message to Svetlana, we need to help Strelkov. She goes to doctor friends, they try and diagnose what might be wrong with him, they start sending medicines. When someone who's helping them smuggle letters in and out goes to Moscow, they sleep on Svetlana's floor. So there's a large network of support that develops spontaneously among prisoners and their families and relatives and friends. And that continues after their release. Lev, for example, You know, they meet with other prisoners' families that they've known all this time. So I think that that probably reinforces their tendency to have a collective narrative. Yeah? That they put it in terms of not necessarily individual survival. I think Lev, as that letter that Carla read out suggests, he was crushed. I think he was really crushed by the time he spent in the camp. So I don't think he had a strong sense at the end of it. I mean, I think he recovers, but I don't think in the 50s and 60s he had a strong sense of necessarily individual survival like Neto did. He's a different personality. But I think that through those networks of people, they tend to have a collective narrative. And then, of course, there's another layer about this. The people in Norilsk, they still live in Norilsk. They don't leave Norilsk. They're prisoners, and then they're released out of the zone, but they have nowhere to go. Many of them in Norilsk come from Ukraine. It's very common to get from Norilsk to Ukraine is quite a long journey. It's quite expensive. They're not given any help. And even if they do make it all the way to Ukraine, then it's not likely they will find anybody there. So they go back to Norilsk quite often. So basically, in places like Norilsk or other places which have developed on the basis of a gulag camp, there's a natural collectivism there, which is about what they've all been through. And so they think of what they've achieved as something positive. And I can understand that. I think it's a way of switching the meaning of their experience from being a prisoner to one of being a worker.
What did they say about the uprising?
Oh, the uprising. Well, I think the uprising was, there were many uprisings, and the Norilsk uprising, which is the biggest of them, comes down to people like Neto. It comes down to the fact that there were enough men, and it was men, who had a fearlessness and who wanted to assert their dignity, their rights, they didn't want the end. I mean, they weren't fighting for release in Norilsk in May 50. They were fighting for better conditions. It's an exceptional thing, and I think that the uprising is mainly. I mean, going back to what I said yesterday about soldiers being the real fighting organising force. I think the fact that so many of the Norilsk prisoners, and certainly virtually all of the leaders and participants of the uprising, had been fighters in the war is really significant. You know, and they say, Neto says it many times in his interview, we weren't afraid of death.
Carla, no sé si alguien más va a preguntar. Una consulta, estamos ya casi sobre la hora que tenemos planificada, casi de manera exacta. Así que lo dejamos entonces hasta aquí hoy día.